And in Wisconsin and states like that, this is just called winter. But everybody's like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So thank you for being those brave souls who would actually go outside. So I'm Marianne Williamson, obviously, but this is Tiana David, and she'll introduce the evening.
Yes. Thanks so much. What a beautiful, cozy opportunity to be here together discussing important, meaningful life things. So Integrative Politics is a series that came about last June. It was our CEO, Paulette Cole, and Marianne Williamson who dreamed it up. And we're so excited tonight to have with us from Florida, Alan Grayson, former U.S. representative and current congressional candidate. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Our guests tonight embody our commitment to personal growth and social transformation. With deep integrity and insight, Marianne and Alan work passionately every day to create a new reality of peace, justice, and equality for all of us. Our Integrative Politics series host, Marianne Williamson, has meaningfully impacted millions of lives through her activism, her live speaking, and her internationally acclaimed books. She's been visionary in recognizing the underground wounds in the collective, and in 1997 wrote the book Healing the Soul of America, Reclaiming Our Voices as Spiritual Citizens. This year, Marianne is touring the country on a Love America tour, discussing how a revolution in consciousness paves the way to both personal and national renewal. Alan Grayson is a former U.S. representative in Orlando and a current congressional candidate. He grew up in the Bronx here in New York, got a college and law degree from Harvard, and an MA from the Harvard School of Government. He worked in business for several years before returning to law. And then Alan began to represent whistleblowers who witnessed fraud against the government. He is the only attorney to bring a fraud case to trial against those who profited illegally from the war in Iraq and win. Please join me in welcoming Alan Grayson and Marianne Williamson.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiana. She mentioned Paulette, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight, the CEO of ABC. I adore her, as do we all. And this Integrative Politics series has been a treat for me because I'm often a kind of odd person out with the spiritual crowd, a little bit of the, there she goes about politics again. And with the political crowd, you know, she's okay, but the spiritual thing she's got going on. So I often feel like I'm not totally accepted anywhere. But things are changing because the kind of conversation that we have here, I think, is becoming less fringe. More people are recognizing that the same kind of integrative approach that we take towards healing the body applies to society as well. Several years ago, I ran for Congress myself in Los Angeles. And when I first was campaigning, I was on an internet program with Sean Stone. And he said, what would you do if you were elected to Congress? What would be the first thing you would do? I said, I would walk over to Alan Grayson's office, and I would sit there. And he doesn't know me, but I would tell him that I'm his new best friend, and what are we doing today? Because he was someone who, when he was in Congress, every time I saw what he was doing, I was like, yeah, that's what I would do, yeah. And so Sean Stone delighted me by saying, well, I could introduce you to Congressman Grayson, who has been, in my knowing him personally, every bit as wonderful as a human being as he was and hopefully will be again as a U.S. Congressman. I'm excited to have been able to invite Alan to be with us tonight because I know that he will contribute in a very meaningful way to the conversation that we have here. A few years ago, I read a book by Sue Monk Kidd, who wrote The Secret Life of Bees. It's called The Invention of Wings. And The Invention of Wings is a dramatization of the lives of two women who actually existed, named the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina, and then having later in their lives, not later in their lives, but in their young womanhood actually, been converted by the Quakers, became leading abolitionists and then leading feminists. And in those days, if you were born into a slave-owning family in the South, and you yourself awakened to the evils of slavery, you were cast out. You were not just cast out of your family, you were cast out of the community, you were cast out of the state, everything. And one of the things that this book made me think about was the psychological and spiritual and emotional transition from anti-slavery to abolitionist. Because if you were anti-slavery, all that meant was that you didn't agree with slavery. All that meant was that you would say something like, I live in Massachusetts, I think those slave-owning states are crazy, I would never do it, I would never own a slave, and I totally think it's wrong. That position did not in and of itself move the needle for one slave. To become an abolitionist means you crossed a bridge. You crossed a bridge inside yourself. And you went from, I'm against it, to not on my watch. Now, it's not an accident that the abolitionist movement arose from the Quakers, because like many of the great social justice movements in the United States, it emerged from the religious and spiritual impulse. The spiritual and religious impulse, which goes beyond the intellectual, to a compulsion to make a stand, to know that you don't just recognize evil, you say no to evil. You don't just recognize that there is another possibility, you devote your life to the invocation of the other possibility. So it's not an accident that abolition emerged from the Quakers. It's not an accident that many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. And of course, it's not an accident that Dr. King, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was, of course, a Baptist preacher. So I think that we are living at a time where much of the dominant political conversation is inadequate to the task that lies before us. Because we have, like other generations have before, the challenge to push back some profoundly anti-democratic forces. And I think it is naive of us to think that that pushback will be attained in any kind of fundamental way if we're simply trying to do so through an intellectual, wonky argument. Because you know, the part of the brain that understands an issue from an intellectual perspective is probably about 100,000 years old. But the part of the brain that responds to primal fear and primal love goes back way, 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 way longer than that. So what we have among us now is represented, whether it is represented through the form of slavery, whether it is represented through the form of oppression of women, whether it is represented through a denial of civil rights, white supremacy, segregation, whether it's represented by denial of rights to gay people or any other force, is actually a legacy of the very archetype of aristocracy that this country was founded to repudiate. Now, we are not the first generation that has had to face these forces, and we're not the first generation to be challenged to push back against them. The question is whether we will not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to push these forces back. And if we think we will do so, only through intellectual argument, only through traditional political strategizing and activism, without including the expanded aspects of consciousness which the Quakers embodied and which the civil rights movement embodied, which went way beyond mere intellectual understanding to genuine spiritual fervor, to something way more than I don't agree with this, that went into a level of dedication and commitment and courage that it is only possible when you are thinking about something bigger than yourself. And what has happened in this country, particularly since the 1980s, is such a glorification of self. And even the higher consciousness community has acquiesced to it and in some ways fostered it. We've actually promulgated in some parts of our own community the notion that for all intents and purposes, there's no higher spiritual mountaintop than manifesting your dreams. Let me tell you something. Hitler manifested his dreams. There's something a lot more important going on than you getting what you want. And a generation that is only after getting what I want, because I want it, will not be able to push back against the anti-democratic forces in our midst, because those anti-democratic forces were able to do what they've done because we were so disengaged from the political process, because we were so busy just getting what we want. And so democracy carries with it both a gift and a responsibility. And that gift is that you can do what you want. That's the gift of a free society. That's the gift of a democracy, is that you can self-actualize. But the responsibility of democracy is that if you don't also concern yourself with the common good, if you don't also concern yourself with the collective, then you will also lose your individual freedom. Ultimately, I don't care what the public issue is, it will get to your private door. Jesus did not say, love yourself. Islam, which I know Alan will probably be mentioning, in the Jewish religion, is to repair the world. The spiritual mountaintop is not just manifesting what you want for yourself. The spiritual mountaintop emerges from the recognition that there is only one of us here. That's the esoteric meaning of the line, there is only one begotten Son. The traditional Christians take it to mean that Jesus was the Son of God and no one else is. But in books like The Course in Miracles, there is only one begotten Son means there's only one of us here. In the realm of the three dimensions, this illusion of consciousness, as Einstein said, the three dimensions are an illusion of consciousness, albeit a persistent one. So within this illusion, you're over there and I'm over here. But in the quantum realm behind that, which is the realm of truth, ultimate reality, there's actually no place where you stop and I start. So what I do for you, I'm doing for myself, and what I withhold from you, I withhold from myself. And if I just go around living my life, making it all about me, not caring about you, I will pay a karmic consequence for that. And once you really think about it, you realize that all a nation is a collection of individuals. So the same psychological and spiritual principles that prevail within the life of one individual prevail within the life of a nation. A woman I know who was on one of those planes that hit the World Trade Center, World Trade Buildings, who died on that plane, was one of the kindest, sweetest people I have ever met in my life. If you ever wanted anybody in the world to see, this is who we are, this is who Americans are, Barry Berenson would have been someone that you would say, look at her, see how great she is? But she happened to be on that plane. And that is true of everyone who was on those planes. It's true of everyone who was in the Pentagon that day. That was true of everyone who was in the buildings that day. You're not just living out the karmic consequences of your own actions. We're also experiencing the karmic consequences of our collective actions. So in order to live a mature life, in order to live a responsible life, in order to live a conscious life, we must address not just the level of cause that applies to us as individuals, but also the level of cause that applies to the nation and the collective. So the idea of political ditziness and disengagement from the political processes, certainly justified by any artificial notion of spirituality, that has got to end. There is no serious spiritual or religious path that gives any one of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. But for those of us here who do come at all of this from a spiritual perspective, we don't want to go into the political conversation as it is now carried out. It is not integrative. It is completely allopathic. It only talks about externalities. It only talks about symptoms. And we know from our holistic perspective, when it comes to the body and every other aspect of wellness, that if you just treat symptoms, you just want to suppress and eradicate symptoms, then the symptoms will just morph into some other form. We have to address the cause of these issues. And that has to do with some deeper intellectual understanding, and it also has to do with the spiritual and the emotional and the psychological understanding. When it comes to the spiritual understanding, among other things, it means none of this is going to work if we don't have courage. None of this will work if we don't have devotion to those who aren't even born yet. It can't just be about what I want. It's got to be about what our unborn grandchildren will need. We can't just think in terms of what I want or even what America wants. It's got to be about what humanity will need in order to survive the next 50 years and the next 100 years. And this Integrative Politics series is a place where we have that larger conversation. And this is one place out of many where even people who aren't yet having the conversation yet are yearning to have it. And I just know for myself, I'm so happy to be in a place where, because of Paulette, because of all of you, that conversation is welcome. It's something we are almosting, as James Joyce, I love that expression, in almosting. Sometimes you're almosting something. I think there's a new political conversation in America that we are almosting. It's not really new, though. Gandhi had that conversation. King had that conversation. Anybody who has ever moved society forward has had that conversation, because really moving society forward is not just about horizontal axis where you are tempted to then dumb down your message so more people agree with you. It's where you go deep, it's where you go vertical. You don't care who agrees with you, because you know that 10 people who understand what you're saying is actually more of a conviction and therefore more of a force multiplier than 100 people who agree with you, but it's such a shallow conversation, what does it matter? This is a place where we are permitting ourselves to go deep and to go vertical. And that's what I love about it. And I don't just love it because it's my own temperamental propensity. I love it because I actually think it's going to save our country and it's going to save our world. So thank you very much for being here. And I am really proud and delighted to introduce you to one of my very favorite people, as well as one of my favorite politicians, Congressman Alan Grayson.
Thank you, Marianne. I couldn't possibly top that introduction. I recall an experiment that was reported, a scientific experiment reported a couple of years ago. It was by a Dutch experimenter. He put two monkeys in a cage next to each other. Sometimes they could see each other, sometimes they couldn't. And in particular, he rewarded them based upon the point he was trying to learn about, which was, do monkeys have some kind of moral sense? And what he did specifically was, if they did a certain task and they were watching each other, they could see each other, he'd give them a little nut as a reward. And they both loved it. They absolutely loved doing that little task and getting their little nut, and everybody was happy. And he found that that was true whether or not they could see each other. They were happy whether or not they could see each other. They reacted the same way. However, he changed it up a little bit, and he decided that for one monkey, he was going to give that monkey the existing reward, the nut. For the other monkey, the monkey was going to get a very juicy, sweet grape for the same task. Well, what happened, and you can see this on YouTube yourself, it's not that hard to find it, what happened was that when he gave the second monkey the grape, the first monkey took the nut and threw it in his face. So monkeys do have a moral sense, and that sense is you got to be fair. The monkeys feel that way, and frankly, human beings feel the same way. If it's in the monkeys, it's in us too. You got to be fair. Now, I'll tell you something else. There's another scientific experiment just reported within the past week. They dug up a new Neanderthal skeleton, and they found the Neanderthal who had been very badly injured and had received something resembling primitive medical care. So it looks like Neanderthals had universal health care, which makes you wonder, if they had it, then why don't we? In addition to that, it was clear from the burial site that the Neanderthal who had been injured had also gotten something more than medical care. The Neanderthal got something resembling love, something resembling actual physical care for somebody who was suffering. Once again, if the Neanderthals feel that way, it's safe to say that we Cro-Magnons feel that way too. We understand that when somebody's injured, you got to do something. And it's remarkable, really, that it's even debatable. You occasionally will hear people making the argument, healthcare is a human right, but they're quickly shouted down by people who say, well, it's too expensive and some people don't want it and blah, 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 blah. This is something I wrestled with in my first term in Congress. The President Obama came and gave a speech. He gave it to the assembled members of Congress and the Senate, And at one point, talking about health care, he turned to Republicans and said, look, if you've got some good ideas, tell them to us. Now, the Republicans had gotten an advance copy of the speech. So at that point in his speech, with the C-SPAN cameras rolling, the Republicans waved something in the air, some kind of plan of some, I didn't know what it was. I didn't realize the Republicans actually had a health care plan. So after the president was finished, I waited until the room cleared. I went over to the other side. I picked up one of the items they had been waving in the air, and it was a blank piece of paper. And I realized that really is the Republican health care plan, a blank piece of paper. So the next day I explained this. I explained what I experienced, and I said, you know, I now understand differently. I know what their plan actually is. I said the Republican health care plan is don't get sick. That's their plan. And if you do get sick, die quickly. And what I was doing was, of course, mocking them. They were infuriated by that. They immediately attacked me. The next 4 speakers threw away their prepared scripts and said that I was outrageous, I was terrible, which I thought was interesting because nobody even recognizes political satire anymore. Nobody even recognizes it. I had to remind the Republicans that when it was proposed a long time ago that during the Irish famine, the Irish eat their children, that wasn't a real proposal. Jonathan Swift wasn't actually telling the Irish, recommending them to go eat their children. He was making a satirical point. And it was the same thing with me. I was making a satirical point. But still, an important point. Now, when we made our effort to make universal health care a reality in this country, and by the way, the Germans had it in the 1800s. One of the first things Bismarck did when he took over the country was to institute universal health care in Germany. We're still waiting. Still, we have 20, 30 million people who don't have health coverage in this country. They can't see a doctor when they're sick. They can't get the care they need to stay healthy and alive. And the reason why I'm mentioning this now is because it goes to the heart of what we need to do to integrate politics in this country, and specifically to integrate it with morality. We had a lot of conversations with representatives from the White House. The White House was, in many respects, a polling operation. Their pollsters ruled the roost. I'm referring to the first term of the Obama administration. And they would come to us and give us all of their wisdom, their insight, which normally consisted of trying to remove anything resembling morality from political debate. And in particular, I remember a meeting that we had with them where they came and they showed us some numbers, and they said to us, what you need to do to convince America of the need for universal health care is, first of all, don't mention the uninsured. Don't mention the uninsured at all because they don't vote. And they're not an effective audience if they don't vote. That's not who we're looking for. We're looking to persuade voters. And secondly, what they said was, what you need to do is present it to Americans with coverage as it's going to save them money. What we're going to do, they explained, was we're going to bend the cost curve. They wanted us to say, you know, the cost curve now is going like this, and instead we're making it going to go like this. Well, that's a beautiful thing. It almost looks like flying, doesn't it? But go ahead and try to explain that to an actual living, breathing voter. I raised my hand and I said, why would you bend a curve at all? It's already bent. Nobody seemed to understand that concept. We had a news conference. I was one of the freshman Democrats who was invited to speak. We knew our lines. Everybody said, bend the cost curve, bend the cost curve, bend the cost curve. I said something different. I said that there is a 3,000-year-old imperative in every civilized society to shelter the homeless, to feed the hungry, and to heal the sick. And then I stopped speaking, and everyone was utterly mortified because I had introduced the moral element into politics. And that's something that our side seems to be rather reluctant to do. I don't know whether you're liberal or conservative, it doesn't really matter to me. But I will tell you that on my side of the political spectrum, on the liberal side, people tend to shy away from that argument. And I've never really understood why. I really do believe that our political views are rooted in 3,000-year-old morality. Tikkun Olam. What does that mean? Heal the world. It is literally taking a body metaphor, an integrative metaphor, and applying it to politics in a way that can be universalized, that can answer many, many questions. Not just the question of health care, but also the question of education, also the question of Social Security, also the question of wages, a living wage, also the question of benefits. Why do we insist that people go to work when they are sick or otherwise they get fired? I have 5 children. Every time one of my kids gets sick, if they happen to escape me and go to school on their own, I have to go and pick them up, even if it's in the middle of the day, because sick children are not allowed in school. But sick workers must go to work. They must go to work. That seems wrong on many levels, both practical and moral. But I think that we need to stop shying away from ethical arguments, from moral arguments, because ultimately that's what's in people's hearts. And I saw this very effectively when I was in my first term in Congress. There was a terrible tragedy in Haiti. My goodness, Haiti's had so many terrible tragedies over the years, it's hard to keep it straight which one we're talking about. And that's true around the world. But what struck me was that when people heard about it, when they saw it on TV, we had hundreds of people call my office and say, what can I do to help? And that was very revealing to me. For the most part, these are people who had never been to Haiti, almost all of them. These are people who probably couldn't find Haiti on a globe. These are people who didn't know any Haitians. These are people who didn't speak Creole, couldn't understand what people were saying on the screen. But nevertheless, they could see people in need. They could see that some other human beings, people who they recognized that somehow similar to them in some important respect, needed help. And that impulse, the impulse to help somebody in need, is something that we should cherish. Now, what is wrong with President Trump? What's fundamentally wrong with him? He clearly lacks that impulse. He's rude, he's boorish, but in particular, above all, he's selfish. If your id and your ego had a love child, it would be Donald Trump. And that, that's something that represents a whole other way of doing politics. It is, as Marianne said, the exaltation, the glorification of the ego, of the self, above everyone else. To the point where he literally attacks the people who are working for him, the people who are trying to do their jobs, everyone in his life except for his family. His family somehow get a free pass in general, maybe not Jared Kushner, that remains to be seen, but everybody gets attacked because everybody must be dragged down below the ego. That's not the way human beings really are. That's not who we are. I've been to every country in the world, every single one, every member of the United Nations. I've been to the North Pole, I've been to the South Pole. There are certain things that we all share. Not a whole lot, but enough. One thing we all share, interestingly enough, is that everywhere in the world people want to fall in love. Even in countries with arranged marriages, people want to fall in love. It's very interesting. Everywhere in the world, people love children. Not just their own children, but also other people's children. And everywhere in the world, people respond to someone else in need. And that is a beautiful thing. It's not just, ain't that America, but ain't that human? Thank you all very much.
Now, Tana, you said you or someone will be, if you'd like to ask a question of the Congressman or myself, raise your hand. Somebody's going to give you a postcard, and you'll write something down, and then put your hand up again when you're finished, and somebody will pick it up. So, Alan, JFK, President John Kennedy, said, "We cannot afford to be materially rich and spiritually poor." Obviously, Martin Luther King's political conversation, was of the spirit. Bobby Kennedy said this was a contest for the soul of America. But starting not only with the glorification of greed that we were and the demonization of the government that we were talking about in the 80s and the Reagan years, but also with what happened to the Democratic Party as well, even after that. Very corporatized, very over-secularized. African-American culture has never broken the connection between religious and spiritual impulse and progressive politics. But everywhere else, it's this very corporatized conversation, which, as you said, isn't how people are. And so it's not surprising that so many of the most soulful people have been the most turned off to politics because it just doesn't seem to address those deeper issues. Now, however, because of the political crisis that we're in now, more and more people do realize that we have to re-engage. So what's actually happening now is that there are a lot of people who want to re-engage but kind of don't necessarily remember all the civics that they learned when they were in the 7th grade, or maybe they didn't. So actually a lot of what you can give to us is some kind of standard political information that some people just don't sort of feel necessarily connected with anymore. For instance, we're going to have the midterm elections. I think people have woken up. I think in general, progressives have tended to like the hot and sexy presidential campaigns. And we're not necessarily as responsive to midterms, local elections, state elections, and so forth. A lot of that's changing. But now a lot of people want to come back in and kind of could use some information and some tools about what actually goes on in Congress. You were there. You are deeply considering, from what I hear, making a run to go back. What do those of us who, and those in this audience and those listening, who know that it matters, but simply kind of haven't been looking until recently, now know that they need to see it, what is it that we need to know? We know how corrupt it is. We know the undue influence of money on our politics. We know that the U.S. government has become a system of legalized bribery. We know that the U.S. government is now, for all intents and purposes, more handmaiden to multinational corporate forces than to the people of the United States. We know that instead of the people, by the people, and for the people, we've become of a few of the people, by a few of the people, and for a few of the people. So what are people supposed to do with the disgust at all that? How do you juxtapose the disgust that people feel with the fact that we have to re-engage because the fate of our democracy is at stake?
Well, first, I want people to understand that it actually does make a difference.
That what?
It makes a difference. It makes a difference if people participate or not. And I'm not just talking about people running for office. I mean, I wasn't elected to anything at all in the first half century of my life, and somehow found a way to make a difference rather quickly. When I was in Congress the last 4 years, I passed 121 pieces of legislation, even though I was a Democrat, and the Republicans were in charge. This was the John Boehner administration of the House of Representatives. So first, one person can make a difference. But secondly, you don't need to be an elected official to be able to make a difference. You can help other people to get elected or simply express your point of view. And it is surprising, but on certain issues, it does actually make a difference. And it's important for people to recognize that and to participate. As I think it was Pericles said in ancient Greece, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And you have to defend yourself. You have to make sure that you engage simply to be able to protect the things that are important to you, whether it's choice, to give an example, whether it's your Social Security, your Medicare, whatever it may be. In many cases, your health care. I remember standing outside of Congress when I couldn't take it anymore, hearing one speech after another when we were just about to vote on health care back in my first term. And I had heard enough of the speeches. I heard it all before. So what I did was I walked outside, and they had the Capitol Police had separated all of the they were called protesters, but that's not an accurate description. The participants, the people who cared enough to show up, the people who understood that 99% of life is showing up. Those are the people who were there that day. And the Capitol Police had separated them from us. And I thought that was unfortunate. I didn't want to make a scene, but I spoke to the person in charge among the Capitol Police. I said, I'd like to speak to people in the crowd. He said, that's not necessarily a good idea. I said, I know. He said, well, if you're going to go into the crowd, then let us go with you. I said, that's fine. That makes perfect sense to me. So I took a half dozen of them. We went into the crowd, and I spoke to people. And these are people who literally understood what I said about what Pericles said. They were there to protect themselves. One of them was in a wheelchair. He said to me, I want you to vote yes tonight. I said, why? He said, because if you don't, I'm going to die. I cannot afford the care that I need any longer. If you don't vote for this, I'm going to die. That struck me as being a very effective argument. That was a good argument. And in fact, 90% of the time, on 90% of the issues, the lobbyists get their way. But then when people participate, it's a whole different story. And we had an example of that regarding the president's response to the gas attack in Syria. The president said he drew his red line. President Obama said we're going to attack Syria as a result of this. I had the benefit of military briefings. I, on the basis of what I heard, including classified information, concluded that was a very bad idea. A very, very bad idea. And a lot of people weren't willing to take on the commander-in-chief in order to be able to, maintain their own position, particularly someone who's a member of your own party. I didn't feel that way. I felt we were heading for disaster. It was the war in Iraq that brought me to Congress. I didn't want to see a second, third, fourth, fifth war in the Middle East. I didn't want to see that kind of proliferation. And I realized that it's never as easy as they say it is. They don't greet you and hand you flowers for your gun barrels the way that they led us to believe in the Bush administration. That's not how it works in reality. So I went on TV. I banged the drums, sent out emails to our list of 500,000 people who get our emails. I was on national TV 7 times in one day. And I very patiently made the argument against war, for peace, something you hardly ever hear anymore. And it didn't matter. Okay, it didn't matter. What did matter is that people started to call. People started to email. People started to send faxes. You may not realize this, but there's still something called a fax machine, and there's one in every congressional office. And that was what turned out to matter. And I had both Democrats and Republicans telling me after a couple of weeks of this, 40 media interviews in 3 days, after a couple of weeks of this, when I was very patiently explaining, if we go ahead and do this, this is what is going to happen. We won because people got engaged. Because, as members told me, the calls were running 100 to 1 against a new war in the Middle East. And that's what really mattered. So what really matters is, at the right moment, that you matter. That's what really matters, that you matter. So yes, people once woke can understand their own power. And it applies to both Democrats and Republicans. When something happens called blowing up the phones, which isn't exactly what it sounds like, it's not really that the phones blow up, but when we get so many calls coming in that every time you call you end up in voicemail because there's nobody who can grab the phones fast enough to take the call, that's a good sign.
Right.
That's a very good sign. So yes, people should understand that participation makes a difference.
Yeah, I left a message for Senator Gillibrand after the Al Franken thing. I wanted her to know how I felt. And when I got a voicemail machine, I figured it was because everybody was calling, so I just ranted on her voicemail machine at her office. You know, when you were talking about the health care, so President Trump was very passionate about wanting to get rid of Obamacare, and he kept saying he was going to replace it with something beautiful, remember? And of course, it has not been replaced with anything. So we were saying earlier that the era of disengagement has got to end, and cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. So let's say you are someone who really gets how important it is, and it is, it could not be more important, that we get very, very active about the 2018 midterms. And also, when Alan was talking about showing up, I will be in Charleston, South Carolina this weekend, or I would definitely be in Washington for the rally, for the march. about gun safety, and I assume those rallies will be in different places as well. These marches are important, but the most important march now is the march to the polls in November. But I think it's something for us to understand. We understand how important it is to change the makeup of Congress. We do not have a parliamentary system. It pretty much is winner take all. So right now you have the Republicans in charge of both the House and the Senate. So the idea is that perhaps, as Abraham Lincoln said, there's not that much evil that any one government can perpetrate in the United States as long as the people remain vigilant. And he was referring there to the fact that every 2 years, theoretically, you could completely change the makeup of Congress because every member of the House of Representatives has to run again. Now, with voter suppression efforts, gerrymandering, et cetera, and every other form of meddling and problem we have, there's a lot of barrier to that power that we have, and the only antidote to that is a massive citizen uprising. So just like friends don't let friends drive drunk, friends don't let friends not vote in 2018. But what I want to ask about specifically is the issue of health care and what will happen if the Democrats take back the House in 2018. Right now, we know how much of Obamacare has been undermined. We know that no replacement has been given. What will the Democrats, if the Democrats win the House in 2018, what will be, do you think, the effort that will then be put forward by them that might lead us towards universal health care? You were talking about the millions of uninsured. You know, the problem in the United States from a psychological, emotional perspective is that millions of Americans live with chronic economic despair. And a lot of that economic despair emerges from the fact, what will I do if I get sick? What will I do if one of my kids gets sick? And so we use an expression like universal health care. It sounds kind of dry, but there's nothing dry about it because it is addressing deep human anxiety. People can't create when we're stressed. People can't actualize when we're filled with anxiety. And that's the worst part of economic despair. That's the worst part about worrying about health care. How do you really show up and create and do fabulous things which God created you to do if you're so worried? And that's why health care matters so much. On a purely political level, though, what will happen where do you see it going if, in fact, the Democrats win the House in 2018?
Well, I'll answer your question, but first let me point out that the despair you're describing itself has a health component to it. There was a recent South African study that showed that people who are facing economic, shall we say, challenges in their lives are 14 times more likely to have a heart attack.
Sick?
Yes, to have a heart attack. That's
right, so let's just say that again. I want to take a moment for you to repeat that because it's so big. A South African study that showed people who do not have health care.
People facing an economic challenge.
Okay.
People facing an economic challenge, meaning you lost your job, you went bankrupt, something of that nature. People facing an economic challenge are 14 times more likely to have a heart attack. Now, and by the way, another interesting statistic from the United States. In this country, rich people live approximately 12 years longer on the average than poor people do. 12 years longer.
Is that because of better health care?
Well, yes. The primary reason is simply that if you don't have the health coverage, you have a 40% greater chance of dying each year. I said that to a Republican member of Congress. He said to me, well, you're being silly. People are going to die sooner or later, no matter what. So I didn't know what to say in response to that. That sort of ended the conversation. But to get back to what your question was, I think that the answer is a bill that I introduced. I introduced the Medicare You Can Buy Into Act. And, think about it. We create this system that extends, called Medicare, extends from Nome, Alaska to Key West, from sea to shining sea, literally. Anywhere you go in the United States, you can benefit from Medicare and get the care that you need, and then we limit it to 1/6 of the population. It's like saying that only seniors could drive on the interstate highways. Imagine the horror of that. And the result of that is that we all end up suffering. Now, the Republicans know their game plan. They're trying to privatize Medicare through Medicare Advantage and otherwise. They want to take out the public element of it. But this is a system that actually has very low costs.
Right.
You spend 3% on administration instead of over 20% on administration. The average person who benefits from it costs the government roughly $7,000 or $8,000 a year, as compared to a much higher rate through private insurance. So just logically, that would be one way to go. We priced it out. We asked ourselves, what would it cost for people to buy in to Medicare? And the numbers that came back were, for children, $118 a month. Now tell me where you can get health coverage of any kind, much less comprehensive coverage that people actually like, for $118 a month. And for people who are not 65 yet, it costs about $470 a month, much less than you'd spend any other way. And now that there are the affordability credits under Obamacare, it is definitely affordable for those people who make less than $80,000 a year. They'd be receiving a subsidy.
But it's interesting because when you were talking earlier about the cost curve issue and how you were feeling pressure from the White House to talk about these things in economic terms, and you were talking about your willingness to talk about them in moral terms, even with everything that you just said, as significant as that is, that's still only contextualizing the issue within economic terms. The problem from a spiritual perspective is that we do use economic principle to order our civilization. And the spiritual transition is from an economic ordering principle of human civilization to a humanitarian organizing principle of human civilization, that you make love the bottom line. Now, some people would say that that's very naive, that's very soft and naive, but I'm reminded of a line in the Course in Miracles that says, love restores reason and not the other way around. People who are economically challenged are not only more likely to get sick. People who are economically challenged, as I was saying before, cannot create. And that is the moment, et cetera. If you really are thinking consciously in terms of how to have the most abundant economy 10 years from now, you know that you take care of your kids who are 10 years old today, 15 years old today. So nothing could be more abundant for the U.S. economy than not only health care, but every kind of advantage to America's children. You know, most of our laws, the entire outlook on laws, come, first of all, they are attitudinal relics of the 20th century. The 20th century mind was different than the 19th century mind. The 19th century mind was different than the 18th century mind. The 21st century mind is different than the 20th, except in politics, where they're still stuck in 1995. And among other things, it's an attitude. There are two elements that are significant. One is, with all due respect, most of this came from men, and the issue that I'm talking about here does not have to do with patriarchal prejudice. It has to do with the fact that you're talking about a time in which most men were not at home with little children. So they didn't actually have a visceral experience of seeing how much genius lies in these little ones. There's a term today called lost Einsteins, talking about how if you really want to mine the gold, the domestic energy that is unmined in the United States, look at our kindergartens. The second issue has to do with all the sociological evidence that we have right now about what happens in the brain before the age of 8. If we front-loaded our investments, and simply did the right thing and took care of our children, you know, one of the common anthropological characteristics of every mammalian species that survives and thrives is the fierce behavior of the adult female of the species when she senses a threat to her cubs. And even among the hyenas, the adult female hyenas encircle the cubs while they're feeding and will not let the adult males get anywhere near the food until the babies have been fed. Now, surely the women of America could do better than the hyenas. And if we did, why do the hyenas do that? Why do the mama bears do that? Why do the tigers do that? Why do the lionesses do that? Because that is the way for the species to survive. So to love our children and to put our children first is not something that goes against economic abundance or going against the ultimate thriving of the community or the species. It is that which would support it. And I think we need to stand for that. We must not give into this economic prejudice, and I think women feel this sometimes. Because, you know, they've done these studies where if a man feels, what was the study I read? For a woman to feel confident to express her opinion, she needs to feel 80% sure of her facts. For a man to feel confident to express his opinion, he needs to feel 20% sure of his facts.
I can verify that.
So sometimes a woman will feel, well, I just think we should take care of the babies. But we're afraid to say that because we don't have all the economic facts to back us up. So a large part of the courage that we need is a willingness to say, because it's the right thing to do. Because it's the right thing to do. When I was younger, when I was a child, I thought my mother's life was not important enough. You know, she lived a very traditional life. It was all about her children, her home, her husband. And when I was younger, I didn't get it. I wanted to go out and do something important. I wanted to go out there. I thought my mother's life wasn't important enough, and it took me decades to know how wrong I was. First of all, once you become a student of metaphysics, you get there is no out there. That's number one. Number two, one day it's the solstice and I'm dancing, you know, with the girls outside and I have a cut velvet scarf on. And it just hit me, surely the goddess wants more than this from you. The goddess is fierce. And the goddess, basically what the goddess says is exactly what my mother said. The goddess doesn't just say, dance, girls. The goddess says, take care of the children and take care of your home. But the goddess today is saying to us that every child is one of our children and the earth itself is our home. So I think that the women particularly, so much of what has been deemed to be female empowerment over the last few decades has been women adopting patriarchal prejudices and patriarchal language and really just becoming, in many cases, as much a part of the problem as a real solution. So as we go back into this, particularly in politics, let's go back with our language and without apologizing for our moral and spiritual concerns, knowing that we have a better economic argument that you take care of the children. And that when you look at the money we spend on defense, when you look at the money, why we have 4,500 nuclear bombs, you lob, that we know of, you lob 10 of those, society as we know it is over. You lob 100 of those.
Well, we want to kill
Human
everybody
racism.
10 times over.
Right.
That's why.
We're spending billions and billions, and then you have American children who don't even have enough paper in their schools. If you want an amazing economy in the years ahead, and you want a healthier world, and you want a democracy that survives and a human race that has a chance, then you look not only at the children of America, but children all over the world, and you know that's where our investments should be. We know what would create peace on this earth. What would create peace on this earth is greater economic opportunities for women and greater educational opportunities for children. And yet we have an administration seeking to slash the budget of the State Department. I know you know this, and I know you're going to work. Had actually proposed a 30% cut to the State Department. The Congress, even the Republican Congress, said no. The president has come back once again wanting to slash. Why? Because they want to slash those programs just such as those. Violence against women, programs against sex trafficking, expanding economic opportunities for women, educational opportunities for children that actually build democracy. Then you give more money to defense. And as General Mattis, our Secretary of Defense, himself said, you don't fund the State Department fully, then I'm going to need to buy more ammunition. So it's so important that we stand up for these things from a humanitarian perspective because we're not naive. Those people who think that if we don't address these things, that humanity will even survive for another 100 years on this planet, going that direction, actually leeching our society of the help that people need economically, in terms of education, in terms of health care, in terms of opportunity, if they think we can continue that way, giving only money to the richest of the rich, giving only money to issues of brute force, if they think that we can continue this way, and our democracy survive as we know it, and even the human race have a real good chance of thriving for another 100 years, we need to say without apology, and we need to say it clearly, and we need to say it as many times as it need be said. If they think they can continue in that direction, and we survive, they're naive. A woman who says, no, we take care of the children first, and a man who says, I think she's got something there, we are not the naive ones. And the fact that we've been the quiet ones and the fact that we get patted on the head and you just kind of don't worry about it, we'll take care of it, those days are over. You know, as I've been saying for a long time, we're not angry. but we're not kidding either. We must find our voices, and that's what the tigers do. It's what the lions do. It's what the hyenas do. They will be fierce. You come at their babies, they're coming after you. And I think we need to adopt some of that fierceness, and that's what's so cool, that people like you, we just need to be there with you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the crisis. The unspoken crisis that we're facing in America regarding the care of our own children.
Right.
This is something important to me. I have 5 of them. They've all been to public school just as I went to public school. America was the first country in the world, by the way, to have universal public education.
Thomas Jefferson. That was because Thomas Jefferson.
That's right. And Massachusetts was the first place in the world where every single child went to school and learned how to read and how to write and how to count. And that's something that has elevated us and propelled us for generations. Until very recently, we had the highest college graduating percentage in the entire world. In many cases, 2 or 3 times what you saw in other, quote, developed countries. We were educating our children, and therefore we were dominating the world economy. That was the heart of it. That's actually the American dream, to get the best out of everybody. But right now there's a crisis. A few years ago, they did an international test of math. Now, math is the same here, in Shanghai, in Tokyo, in Hamburg. It's the same everywhere. The American students came in dead last. Last. Not 5th, not 12th, not even 18th. They came in last. And that's really shocking.
You know what American children came in first? We came in last on so many things, but you know what they came in first on?
Obesity.
Self-confidence. But also, let's look at how skewed that is, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. When you look at how low American children came in some of those things, really there's a socioeconomic element there. Because in the more advantaged neighborhoods, American children are totally competitive, and those things are brought down because of so many of the children who are receiving subpar education in disadvantaged neighborhoods. That's
exactly right. When you dig into the data, what you find, it's not that Americans are all stupid, that nothing even remotely like that. It's that there is an enormous amount of heterogeneity in our results. Our top students are just as good as top students anywhere in the world. The problem is that we have students on the bottom that other countries don't have. And that's an abandonment of our own children. It represents our breaking the American covenant, the American promise, the American dream, which is to be all you can be, no matter where you're from, no matter what you look like, no matter what language you speak, no matter who you love. That is, in fact, what America is really all about. We don't have a common language, we don't have a common religion, but we do have that common dream. And by saying to our own children, a certain group of you are going to be so underprivileged, if that's a term that even applies here, because we're talking about an underright, not an underprivilege, the right to public education, that you're going to end up being unable to compete against your peers all around the world. We are crippling you, we are handicapping you by denying you a proper education to the point where you can actually see it in the test scores. Now, what's the answer? The answer, one answer comes from George Lakoff, who is a great theorist of liberalism in the 21st century. George Lakoff wrote a book called Don't Think About an Elephant. In the book, he describes how do you get out of the rut that we find ourselves in, and the political rut that we find ourselves in. One of the most frequent questions I hear from people is, how are we going to get past all this division? And beyond division, divisiveness, where we end up talking to people who seem to be like us, but they end up having totally different points of view. Lakoff said that the answer is to ask somebody like that, have you ever helped somebody? And the answer inevitably is yes. That's interesting in itself, isn't it? And then the follow-up question is, how did you feel about it? And that gives us common ground. In the same way that I said earlier, everyone everywhere in the world loves children, and that implies that every child should be treated well enough so that they can reach their potential in life. In the same way, we all do kind of, sort of, love each other and enjoy the experience of helping each other. And that provides us with the common ground that can overcome the divisions in society today.
I think a lot of people might be unclear about what is actually happening there. So the way American education, public education works, and first of all, I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson for a moment. The reason Thomas Jefferson said we needed to have public education was because he said that in order for the people to be the source of governance, that the power would not be in the hands of the government, the power would be in the hands of the people, that we needed to have a system where the critical thought processes of the people were educated so that they could be responsible to the task before them. Now, the way American education is set up is that the money that is given to our schools is based on the tax base in that neighborhood. So if you have a poorer neighborhood, you have more money to give, you have less money to give to the schools, but that's the big contest going on. People who think that state governments should compensate for that shortfall. Some people think that federal government should compensate for that shortfall. And this, by the way, for those of you who are New Yorkers, is very much an issue with our current gubernatorial Democratic primary with Cynthia Nixon, who has now announced her running against Governor Cuomo because her background is around education. So now that you have that context for that conversation, you know, your understanding of what she's saying and what all that is about should be heightened, and it is extremely important.
Well, look, when you finance your schools through property taxes, which is almost universal in the United States and only in the United States, when you do that, you end up with enormous anomalies. There's a school in Palo Alto which, combining public and private funding, has $1 million per student per year. This is a public school. Okay? There are other schools in Mississippi where the number is 1,000 instead of $1 million. $1,000 is supposed to be able to hire you a teacher, build you a school, do all the things that school needs to do, including feed you at lunchtime, and you've got to do that for $1,000 a year for an individual student. It's impossible, and the fact is that we let that be that way. Federal funding actually is focused on two things. One is school construction. The other one is special education. Federal funding doesn't even attempt to address the enormous disparities in the property tax base from place to place around the country. All it does is take care of these two rather isolated but still important things. And when you cut federal funding the way that President Trump has been proposing to do for education, well, you're cutting construction, and honestly, that means that some schools are not going to get built, and there'll be more kids in trailers, but that's been going on for a long time now in America. But also what you're doing is you're cutting special education, and you're cutting it very, very deeply. The federal government provides most of the special education money in this country. That means that those test scores I was referring to earlier get worse and worse and worse. It's not anywhere close to No Child Left Behind. It's millions of children being left behind.
Also, the way that our education is skewed. I understand the need for math and science, et cetera, but look how the arts funding has been taken away. Look how, I think a large part of our political crisis is how many states don't even teach civics to their kids anymore. So if you don't learn the Bill of Rights when you're a child, you don't know to be outraged when it's under assault when you're an adult. So too many children are not learning American history, they're not learning civics, and also the arts are so important. Now, I think that there's so much learned powerlessness because too many people don't even remember when things might have been different. Don't remember when things might have been different, and so don't even know what to ask for. I love the line in the Course in Miracles where it says, you don't ask for too much, you ask for too little. Every single child in America, when you look at the money that we spend on defense, when you look at the money we spend on things like nuclear bombs, 4,500, 100 of those, and it's over. When you look at the kind of corporate subsidies we give and the sucking of money upward into the hands of the 0.1 of 1%, right? And you realize every child in America, if we wanted to, every child in America would have the best arts education. Every child in America would have the best cultural education. Every child in America would have the best access to sports. Every child in America would have the best access to music. Every child in America would have the best access to history education, to math and science, et cetera. I think that there's something, we know this from a spiritual and psychological perspective. You state what you want. So too many of us aren't even stating what we want when it comes to these things anymore. We're asking. I was at an Oxfam conference last week in Washington. I think I mentioned this. So most Americans, if you poll Americans think we spend too much money on international humanitarian aid. And then if you say to that American, well, how much do you think we spend? They go, we spend 25%. And you go, that's what the polls say, most Americans think. Most Americans think we spend too much on international humanitarian aid. They think we spend too much, but they also think we spend 25%. So then you say, well, how much do you think we ought to spend? And they will say 10%. In fact, we spend 1%, which is tiny compared to other industrialized nations. Now, not only that, but of that 1%, the president is currently proposing to slash that by 30 to 40%. So there's an international affairs budget right now for $59.1 billion, and this is one of those things where you can call your congresspeople and your senators at 202-224-3121 and tell them that you want to keep the international affairs budget. But notice, even that with inflation, et cetera, we're just fighting the undertow. At this point, people with any kind of humanitarian concern are just fighting, please, 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 can we keep doing what we've been doing, even though what we've been doing isn't nearly enough? And so our conversation needs to change. We need some audacity here. You know, I think that traditionally, and I know I keep referring to women, not because women are in any way more important, but because I do believe that a large part of this is our finding our voices. You know, in any situation, and you're a father of 5, you don't have a mother, a father, a parent, anyone who cares about children, you would say in your house, because you were talking about before with caring, we should run our country the way we run our lives. And you would always say, well, what about the babies? Are the children okay? Are the children okay? So this idea of really changing the paradigm to the idea that American children, the idea that we're worse than anything, that American children lack anything. Not only that, even though we don't have starvation in America, we do have hunger in America. And 1 in 5 American children are food insecure. A lot of the obesity is actually malnourished children. And they're obese because they keep eating more, trying to get the nourishment that they need.
Well, very true. And very sad, and something that you never see in the news. You know, you turn on CNN.
Oh, great, thank you.
Inevitably, you're going to be seeing something about some woman and Donald Trump. It could be a different woman each day, because that's the way Donald Trump is, I guess. But the fact is that there's no attention ever given in public discourse to these fundamentally important issues about our lives and our future. And that's sad, but at least people can turn to Marianne to get the real scoop.
Okay, questions. Aside from voting and cynicism, well, as I said, cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. How do we interface with a system that completely discounts right and wrong? Well, I know for myself, and if you want to add anything, by all means do, we have to be the voice. I mean, if you haven't talked about what's right and wrong in the public sphere as opposed to just the private sphere on your social media and in your community, then who do you think is supposed to be the voice in democracy except our citizens? And if you haven't left a message as a constituent call or on the voicemail machine of your congresspeople and your senators saying, I want you to do the right thing, it all goes back to us, doesn't it?
The system does not discount right and wrong. The system actually makes wrong try to seem like right. That's how that actually works. This is why you hear, for instance, people talking about their Second Amendment rights. Just to give one random example, they want to be able to elevate the conversation from their perspective so that they're talking about something that they can call a right of theirs. So in reality, what the other side has done is to say our right is bigger than your right, or perhaps even just our right is different from your right, but it's just as important as your right, even if it's not. You know, we see this now constantly. The other side says, well, if we simply armed the teachers, that would solve the problem. No, I'm sorry, that's not correct. That would not solve the problem. What would solve the problem, I guess, and I'm surprised Donald Trump hasn't expressed this idea because it sounds very Trumpian, is if we'd never see guns in the schools if all the children had to go to school naked. Then it would never happen. I'm just waiting for that proposal to come out of Donald Trump's mouth. But what you find is that the system actually is a lengthy and somewhat turgid discourse about actually what is right. And the great genius of Fox News, of Rush Limbaugh, of the entire right-wing movement over the past 40 years has been to depict their impulses toward fear, their impulses toward hatred, their impulses toward callousness as something noble, as something elevated, when in fact it's just not.
Also, I think, and I see this in, quote-unquote, our crowd, the spiritual, this assumption that nobody in politics is grappling with these issues. And that's simply untrue. You know, people in Washington are reading a lot of the same kinds of books that all of us are reading. And they might not be talking about their meditation classes or their whatever, but they're living in American culture just like we are. And I think I meet too many people who don't get involved with campaigns, who haven't met the people running in the primaries in your district, who haven't gone to town halls, who then go spouting off about politicians and what politicians do and don't do, who actually are not necessarily educating themselves on what politicians are doing and not doing. And I also think, you know, like I said, I was in Washington last week and lobbying with Oxfam, and the week before with an organization called Women for Women, which is where you get to sponsor a woman who's a victim of war somewhere. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize how fun it is to lobby. You know, these people know that they work for you. And I think a lot of people, it's just like the habits of democracy that de Tocqueville talked about. It's like anything else in healing your personal life. It's just tweaking you where your attention goes. It's even kind of like when we were talking a few minutes ago. You know, you came here, you showed up for this, you showed up for this conversation. I think some of you in this room probably heard some things about how education is funded that you might not have been totally aware of. So now when you read an article about Cynthia Nixon's ideas about education versus Governor Cuomo's, it's going to catch your attention in a different kind of way. I think politics is kind of like a soap opera. You know, you watch it the first time and you have no idea what these people are, who they are, what the narrative is, but you're homesick, you have the flu, the remote's in your hand. The next day, you turn it on again, you still don't know what the plot is, but you recognize her and you recognize him. About the fourth or fifth day, you're still sick, you turn it on and you go, oh my God, she's having his baby. You're totally hooked, and that's how politics is. You don't even know what's going on, but then after a few articles, then you get it, and then you're engaged. I want to ask you, I'm sorry, go on.
Let me say one more thing about this.
Yeah.
There are times when you see tremendous, even quick change in society, and those are the times when you win the moral argument.
Yes.
Those are the times when people actually are paying attention, and there's some kind of sea change that usually represents the end of demonization by one side against the other. And that's when the moral war gets won, if you will. We've seen a couple of examples recently in our adult lives. One has to do, very visibly, with marriage equality. Why did marriage equality succeed when the right wing could no longer convincingly demonize homosexuality? That's why marriage equality succeeded. Why are we seeing more and more states now adopt the legalization of marijuana? Because reefer madness is no longer a convincing concept to people.
Yeah, that's going to just fall quickly now, just like the gay marriage thing.
The moral argument has been won. Now marijuana is thought of by most people in America as recreational and legitimate, if you will, rather than addictive. So when in the course of that engagement, one side of society engaging with another side of society, one side does occasionally win, and that's when you see social progress.
I think it's important, though, that we put our feet to our prayers. I hear too many people say things along the line of, well, that's bound to happen someday, about something like the marijuana argument. Well, it's not enough to just say someday it's bound to happen, because there are people wasting away in jails all over America today, in prison.
And not voting. There's more than 1 million people who've lost their vote because they were convicted of a marijuana-related offense. Don't hold your breath and wait for Donald Trump to restore their rights.
Well, that's the whole idea of the felon. That's part of the larger voter suppression issue, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So there were questions that were written, and one of the questions, in fact, more than one, of course, had to do with the impeachment of the president. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm in favor of it. I'm convinced already of the That's an interesting thing. You know, now I'm watching this from the outside. I sort of regretted the fact I didn't get to vote already on this. There have been 2 votes already on impeachment, and I have to say that there are a lot of Democrats who are not showing much spine about this, and I feel bad about that. From the public evidence, and I haven't gotten any sort of secret briefings about this, so I only know what I read, the same as everybody else. It's clear to me that the president and his campaign colluded with the Russians during the campaign in illegal manners. I mean, no matter what you may say about stealing emails and disseminating them, whatever else you may say about it, it's illegal. All right? So you have that issue. And I think that it's safe to say, according to the president's own words, that the cover-up was an impeachable offense. In my opinion, based upon the president saying that he fired Comey over the, quote, Russian thing, that's basically the end of the story. I measure this against Watergate, and I see a greater crime, and I see a greater cover-up already, based upon what we already know, and despite the fact that the Republicans, particularly the ones on the so-called intelligence committees, seem to be desperate to try to cover it up. Based on what I've seen already, the case is there. And so I would be in favor of it. And thank my lucky stars that a president this bad, the worst president of my lifetime, probably the worst president of anybody's lifetime, has committed impeachable offenses, and therefore we can get rid of him.
I was a Bernie Sanders supporter, and then when the primaries were over, I became a Hillary Clinton supporter. I agree with Nancy Pelosi about many things. I think she's achieved a lot. I don't agree with her about everything. But I cannot help but feel that many of the attacks against both of them are pure misogyny. That not only, by the way, from men, but from women as well. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about both of those women and the prejudice about them based on their gender.
I definitely agree with that. You know, I was part of the first generation where it was not that unusual to have a woman boss, and my first 4 bosses were all women. And I remember in particular working for the government for several years, and I had a genius one boss who incredibly gifted, intelligent person who really not just ran the office, but produced things that of use to people in a way that I had enormous respect for. You know, she did the job well. That matters a lot to me personally. That's how I measure people. It's not, do I want to go out, and have a beer with them? I don't drink, by the way, so that's never going to happen. But whether, they're showing respect for the job. Do you respect the job? Many people in Congress don't. I felt that I did when I passed 121 pieces of legislation in 4 years. But in any event, I clearly remember working for her. There was somebody who I shared an office with, and he was always making comments about her that had nothing to do with the work. Did you smell her perfume today? It's like a skunk. Did you see what she's wearing? She looks like a hooker. Those kind of comments that she didn't deserve, by the way. I mean, completely unearned on the merits. But it was basically institutionalized misogyny. He didn't like having a woman boss. Well, in fact, for that generation, they had the threat of Hillary Clinton being everybody's boss. And that was very, very, very threatening to a certain part of the population, whether they admitted it to themselves or not. Nancy Pelosi, the same thing is true 3, 4, 5 times over. And she's been attacked by the Republicans as a bossy woman in millions and millions of dollars worth of attack ads all around the country. And that's a shame. We should have moved beyond that a long, long time ago. But they found that it was effective, and by the way, it had enormous entertainment value to them because it meant that over time they could actually choose our leader, or they could hope to choose our leader. And they pressed that button, and they got the result that they wanted in many elections across the country because they're appealing to people's misogyny. There's no other word for it, even in this late date.
I think a lot of women have some internalized misogyny. I think I've seen this in my life. I think most women have this idea that if we do speak our opinion without apology, that we are deemed arrogant or bossy or tough or something in ways that men aren't. And I think we all have a kind of cellular memory of witch burning, and we want approval. And I think it's a big issue that, living a meaningful life is not necessarily a popularity contest. and for us to really take a stand for humanity and the future of humanity in the way that we need to today is by definition to repudiate a status quo that can be vicious if aroused, and which if it feels threatened. And I think that's why sisterhood is so important. You see something going on today, but it's got to be with the Me Too movement, et cetera, but it's got to be beyond just sexual harassment. There are many different forms of harassment, and many different ways that a woman can feel shut down. So I think it's like anything else, we heal one aha at a time. But I think it's not just in claiming our voices that we are going to help co-create this force field that will moving us forward, but also supporting other people when they're using theirs. You can't just wait until the election in November. Get involved in these primaries now. Get involved in the primaries now. Learn who's running, look on their websites. This stuff is only dry until you go deeper. You know, if you just see what the issue is and it just seems dry until you dig deeper and you actually get involved, and it is interesting. I have felt very supported in my life by you, Alan, and I'm so grateful for that, and I'm always excited to support you. I want those of you in New York to be very aware. There is a fundraiser tonight at 29 West 15th Street. We're just going to walk over there, 29 West 15th. Beautiful loft apartment. It's going to be a wonderful private reception with Alan and myself. There's a minimum donation to the campaign to elect Alan Grayson of $300. And those of you who go, you can go to Marianne.com, loveamericatour.com, or what is the website that they would go to for you?
The committee, congressmanwithguts.com.
Congressmanwithguts.com.
Modestly named congressmanwithguts.com.
And you can go to that page and make whatever donation works for you.
Or Act Blue.
Or Act Blue. And if it's not for him, for someone. It's all about our engagement. Somebody didn't just come in and try to steal our democracy. We left this field open. If democracy is a house, we left the windows open and we left the doors open. And many of us in the transformational and higher consciousness community recognize that we were part of that, with a disengagement that in some ways had a spurious, so-called spiritual justification. But I think people have awakened to that. People are ready to change now. Getting involved with these campaigns, giving whatever money is appropriate for you. If most of us just whatever you spend on a Starbucks in a year, you spent on congressional campaigns. Until we get the money out of politics, that's just the way it is. And let's end with that question. We understand since Citizens United, the corporate money that can flood our campaigns. We know that with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's a very small chance that this Supreme Court will overturn Citizens United. If, in fact, we are to believe, which certainly I do, that the greatest moral task of our generation is to get the money out of politics, that the undue influence of money is the cancer underlying all the other cancers. If that's our task, how do we as individual Americans best contribute to the ending of that scourge?
Well, in fact, it's far worse than people even recognize. I was in the courtroom when Citizens United was actually decided. There were only 2 elected officials in the courtroom then. You've heard me talk about this before. Mitch McConnell was sitting 2 seats to my left. Floyd Abrams, the famous First Amendment lawyer, was sitting between us. And as the decision was being announced, Mitch McConnell was euphoric, which is a very scary thing to see, by the way. I mean, it's utterly horrifying. It's like something literally out of a horror movie.
Really, really excited.
Right. He was giggling or gurgling or gargling out of some orifice. I'm not even sure which, but he literally couldn't contain himself. He was so happy about the result that he was hearing.
The Koch brothers,
and I went on MSNBC that night, and I said, if we do nothing, you can kiss this country goodbye. And we have done nothing. But there is hope. In my last 2 congressional elections, out of the 435 of us, there was only 1 member of Congress who was elected in either party who raised most of his money from small contributions, and that was me. 1 out of 435. 1 Democrat, 0 Republicans. But we're starting to see the possibility The Bernie Sanders campaign, Bernie was always talking about those $27 contributions. Bernie raised $240 million that way. That was a very healthy amount of money for any presidential campaign. He raised more than Jeb Bush, for instance, to give you an example. And we're starting to see that here and there. Bernie today is the only Senate candidate sitting in the Senate today who raised most of his money from small donors. But it turns out that when you have all those big fish, they actually run away scared when the little fish get together and swim in unison, in formation. The big fish will actually float away. So we're starting to see the possibility of overcoming that. But right now, big money calls all the shots.
So we override that, first of all, by showing up at the polls, massive citizen uprising, but also what about constitutional amendment to establish public funding? Is that the ultimate goal?
You know, it would be nice, but it's so difficult to amend the Constitution. I introduced 8 bills called the Save Democracy Platform. You can still see it on the internet if you want. Just go ahead and Google Save Democracy Grayson, and it comes up right away. These are things that you can pass with a majority of the House, majority of the Senate, and the President's signature. That's a lot easier than getting the huge supermajority that you need in Congress and as well as with the states in order to amend the Constitution. And these are things that actually make sense. For instance, I said you can either lobby or you can make political contributions, but not both. I call that the Pick Your Poison Act. Because if you're lobbying, you're clearly trying to influence the government, and that should not be backed up with political contributions. And 300% lobbying tax, a tax on lobbying, things like this that really would help to clean up the system that don't involve the difficulty of trying to amend the Constitution. The Supreme Court put us in a deep hole, but we can dig out of that hole over time, and you do see it happening. For instance, in Florida, in Tallahassee, we now have public financing of municipal elections. People can designate small amounts of money for particular candidates,
right?
And get a credit for it. And this is the wave of the future, I would say. In general, we desperately need to solve this problem. The reason why we had 60+ votes to appeal Obamacare is because that was the #1 priority of the Koch brothers.
Yeah,
the reason why we had 15 votes to authorize the Keystone Pipeline is because that was the #2 priority of the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers spend every election cycle more than $100 million.
And let's not forget that Scott Pruitt, who's head of the Environmental Protection Agency, sees advocating for the short-term economic benefits to chemical companies and fossil fuel companies as more important in his estimation than the health and well-being of America's children, American citizens, and the planet itself, even to the point of gutting the Clean Water Act, Clean Air or Clean Water, I can't remember.
Both.
Both. And also, one of the first things that he did, there's a pesticide that every scientist hired by the Obama administration had wanted permanently banned because of the substantial evidence of the harm it does to a developing child's brain, a child's developing brain. The first thing that he did after secret meetings with Dow Chemical lobbyists at a hotel room in Houston was he overturned that ban.
Well, it's more general than that. I mean, what we're seeing is a rejection of science, a rejection of logic, a rejection of reason, a rejection of anything resembling genuine expertise. It's sort of the reverse of the Enlightenment. It's the endarkenment. And that's what you see. I was on the Science Technology Committee. I had to constantly remind my peers on the other side of the aisle, it wasn't the Religion Committee. It was the Science and Technology Committee. And the reason for that is that part of the right-wing assault on reason over the past few years is because they recognized reason was an enemy and they needed to overcome it. And this is institutionalized now in the White House. We have somebody in the White House who actually reached the White House without ever actually being elected to anything, without ever being involved in any government agency, without ever serving in the military. He was avoided the draft, and he felt good about that. He felt good that he didn't have that expertise, that he didn't know it. He wasn't tainted by logic or reason or anything like that. The reason why he didn't have to listen to experts is because he only listened to the voices inside his head. And that's been institutionalized now. That is now the status quo. Maybe it started with Ben Carson. I don't know. It used to be if you'd say something was really complicated, you'd say, well, it's brain surgery. This isn't brain surgery. Now Carson has ruined the metaphor. Okay, now you can't even say that anymore. There's a wholesale rejection of anything representing literally right and wrong. And it goes deepest with regard to the environment. Climate denial is an offense against humanity.
Yes, but you don't have to be a political expert to know that climate change denial is an emotional crime against humanity. I don't buy into this myth of the political expert. George Bush was surrounded by political experts, and he took us into Iraq. And Lyndon Johnson was not only surrounded by political experts, he was one of the great political experts of his time, and he took us into Vietnam. If President Trump had wanted to surround himself with political experts, he could have. I think the political experts are like car mechanics in a way. It's important that you have good car mechanics, but I think what we need is the political visionaries who know where the car should be and who recognize what the road is. So I think there's a reason why the founders said just 35 and born here, and nothing else, because they knew at any given time the people should be able to choose the level of the skill set that they feel is most appropriate for the time. And I think that those of us here understand that psychological understanding, emotional understanding, moral understanding, spiritual perspicacity is as important as any other kind of expertise. I hope
that is an expertise. It's
it
not
is
something.
An expertise. It's not, but that's the traditional political expertise.
Right. It's not something that tends to be taught in liberal arts colleges, but in fact, that is an expertise.
Yeah, and the president. It's not that the president didn't know how democracy works. He doesn't seem to have a visceral taste for democracy. I mean, he tends to have more of an authoritarian temperament, etc.
Just like Dr. Strangelove.
If you go to loveamericatour.com, you'll see a list of endorsements for progressive candidates. There are many progressive candidates running all around the country. I think the issue is not even when Alan was talking before about how we get the money out of politics. Don't turn off because it seems complicated and how we're going to do it. The issue ultimately is not how we're going to do it. It's that enough of us know that it must be done. It's what I was talking about earlier tonight, to move from I think they're crazy to not on my watch. And that level of conviction, that changes something inside us. Gandhi said the end is inherent in the means. Everything we do is infused with the energy with which we do it. So don't get pissed, get powerful. And that's the thing right now. Do something. And you know what I always say, everybody? Pray hard, love deep, and kick ass. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Alan. I love you. Thank you, everyone, very, very much. Thank you for being with us here tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Alan Grayson!